Κυρίες και κύριοι, καλησπέρα σας.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello. I am Dimitris Keridis. I am a member of the Hellenic Parliament and professor at the Pantheon University. I will be the moderator of today's event, today's discussion. So welcome to all of you. This discussion will certainly be exciting, amazing, and this is an event organized by a very dynamic institution of the civil society in Thessaloniki, Cultural Society of Entrepreneurs of Northern Greece, very active indeed in cultural things. And the starting point for today's discussion is the bicentenary of the Greek Revolution. And so on that occasion, we are here in order to address a very topical issue, a very momentous and topical issue, that is democracy and the threats against democracy today, not only at the international level, but also in the cradle of democracy and where democracy has indeed developed, Europe and the US. And we have distinguished guests tonight, starting with the professor of the science of government from Harvard University, Daniel Ziblot, the Prime Minister of Greece, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, Evangelos Venizelos, former Deputy Prime Minister of Greece and professor at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and Christina Koulouri, a historian and dean of Pantheon University. With the assistance of Elaine Papoulias from Harvard University, I would like to introduce some of the speakers. I will try to be concise. Allow me just to say that the event will be broadcast live on the Cultural Society's website and its Facebook page, and 2 channels, that is in Greek with simultaneous interpretation into English. So who wishes to follow it in Greek may listen to the Greek channel, otherwise just use the English channel, please. And I would like, having said that, to give the floor to the person who has brought us together, Mr. Andreadis from Thessaloniki, the President of the Cultural Society. The floor is yours. Thank you very much, Dimitris. Indeed, I would like to thank all of you. It's a great pleasure and honor for the Cultural Society of Entrepreneurs of Northern Greece. It's an honor to have with us the Prime Minister of Greece, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, who once again is honoring us with his presence, and this is indeed very important. I would like to thank from the bottom of my heart the Professor Daniel Ziblot, Evangelos Venizelos, Mrs. Koulouri, and Mrs. Papoulias. Dear friends, the rationale of this event, which is part of a series of events, was how a civil society organization as our Cultural Society may contribute to the bicentenary of the Greek Revolution. And apart from celebrations, which of course are useful, such an anniversary is also a useful moment for self-criticism, self-awareness, rethink what happened back then and revisit them in an extended way. And secondly, to discuss thoroughly what has happened since 200 amazing years in which a very small country in an era of turmoil has reached its situation today. And this is something we usually fail to perceive and to understand at its full extension and entity. And so I am confident that this discussion will be very fruitful, very interesting, and allow me just to say that this self-knowledge, self-awareness is a source of strength. Right now, our society needs that strength. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stavros. And I will right away give the floor to Mrs. Koulouri, dear Christina, who is a distinguished historian, who has written much about the Greek Revolution and overall about modern Greek history. And she is a dean at the iconic university, which is dedicated to social sciences, political sciences, that is Pantheon University. You have the floor. The ladies of microphone. Hello, here I am. It is a great pleasure and honor for me indeed to participate in today's discussion, which bridges eras and continents. As a historian of the 21st century, a very important and critical century for the consolidation of modern democracy, I would like to start not from Daniel Ziblot's book, How Democracies Die, but rather what the history teaches us about the future. And because the future changes depending on the present, this year's bicentenary gives us the opportunity to revisit what we believe are self-evident, and then history may be enlightening. So 1821 and the Greek Revolution was the very starting point for the modern Greek state, but also an expression of the European peoples to relinquish monarchy in order to proceed with emancipation. And that was the very starting point for Greece. That started with a revolution which embraced the radical version of constitutionalism, that is democratic constitutionalism. And there are two important pillars that go along the issue of today's discussion. First, the adoption of democratic ideals by Greek revolutionaries, which was not interrupted or suspended by the creation of the Greek state, but rather led to a constitutional revolution on September 3rd, 1843, the overturn of Otto in 1862, and the consolidation of full ballot, universal ballot, in 2 days, in 2 dates, 1864, much earlier than in other European countries. A second pillar is the international character of the Greek Revolution, which was inspired by the French and the American Revolution, while the Greek Revolution was a source of inspiration of a Phil-Hellenic movement in the US and in Europe. Greece, of course, was not unknown to the Western world in 1821. Everyone knew the remnants of ancient Greece, the Greece of philosophers and poets. Modern Greece was in quest of its international acknowledgement, first and foremost, through the recognition of ancient Greece. But at the end of the way, eventually it managed to see itself acknowledged also through political independence and autonomy. I would like to insist on the first pillar, because this is the very way that consolidated, established the Greek state, and which explains the resilience of democracy. In Greece, democracy has passed away in several ways. In both ways, Daniel Ziblot says, by guns and political means. Most recent, of course, we have the military coup and the dictatorship, but our democracy has been repeatedly undermined since 200 years. But this was not exactly a demise, but rather some kind of an interruption which allowed it to reinvigorate, to be renewed. In Greece, the character of constitutions of the revolution, as long as the revolution was underway, were the important legacy for the new state. And possibly this also explains why the institution of monarchy, although it had also some fanatic supporters, did not survive, and which is why in 1874, it was abolished. Today, those who feel nostalgia for monarchy actually are equal to zero. They don't exist. So it's worth noting that the conception of the Greek Revolution all went hand in hand with political emancipation, given that development was feasible not only as a national revolution against Muslims, but also against the Sultan, who represented tyranny and full monarchy. And so through that procedure, the subjects were turned into citizens of a nation state. Very recently, the Greek citizens adopted the constitutional vocabulary, the vocabulary of civil liberties and human rights. National assemblies were organized, the constitution was approved. amidst the revolution. Since the 19th century, Greece belongs to the Western powers, despite the dissemination of Russian-like ideas, as Europe would see Greece, ancient Greece, as the cradle of democracy. Modern Greece, from the very beginning, saw itself, perceived itself as a member of the European family. In the interwar years, and although the country could not avoid a dictatorship, Greece in the Second World War was not an ally of the Axis and resisted fascism and Nazism. The decision of Greece to resist Italian and German fascism goes beyond the wish for national revolution and rather is aligned to freedom and democracy and other universal principles. As we know, despite the defeat of Hitler, anti-Semitism and other situations were not dead after the Second World War, but still survive and sometimes revive on certain points of the European continent. In Greece, the emergence of Golden Dawn in the past decade was alarming for democracy, which again, of course, was the victor through the conviction of the members of Golden Dawn. The fact that democracy has survived all does not mean that we can sleep on our laurels, because democracy is indeed very fragile, and the parliamentarianism very easily may allow the emergence of authoritarian leaders. By way of conclusion, and of course trying to be concise and to stick to the time assigned, I believe that the Greek case shows that resilience of democratic institutions does not depend on the size of a country, but rather that the social powers it consists of, the prevailing political culture, legacy, and the historical memories that have forged its identity. Thank you very much, Christina. Thank you very much. I work at the Pantheon University, so I'm a fellow professor, and in a sense, I have listened to my boss. And having said that, I would like to give the floor to our Professor Evangelos Venizelos. Now, today's discussion also aspires to highlight the importance of politics to converse with the world intelligentsia. And I believe that we all agree on the fact that if Evangelos Venizelos is to be characterized somehow, he has always been a bridge between political theory and political action. And so his presence is indeed very honoring to us. So, Mr. Venizelos, you have the floor. Dear Dimitris, thank you very much for your kind words. I would like to also thank Stavros Andreadis for this honoring invitation. Dear friends, Prime Minister, this year we are celebrating not only the bicentenary from the beginning of the Greek War of Revolution in 1821, but indeed the course of the Hellenic state from the revolution to date. To today's Greece, that is, that despite contradictions, turns and shifts, it is indeed a success story, a Western democracy that in 1952 became a member of NATO. When Cold War was beginning and when all the remaining countries of this neighborhood, except for Turkey, were living in a context of socialism. In 1981, Greece became a member of the European community, now the European Union. It has managed to overcome the threat of the austerity measures and the austerity programs some years ago, and our constitution has survived, and the rule of law is fully functional. This is a country that has been managing pandemic by fully respecting human rights and independent fundamental rights under the control of the Greek court and the European Court for Human Rights and the Court of the European Union. But of course, this is also a country which has growing inequalities, a hybrid and high public debt, but it is a country which, thanks to the means provided also by the European Union, can overcome the economic crisis stirred by the pandemic. In the framework of enlightenment and political romanticism back then in 1821, there was the emergence of many other liberal movements. The constitutions of that era are surprising for their democratic character and the advanced liberal declarations. However, the revolution eventually had to cope with military difficulties, and the battle risked to be lost. The great argument, the great cause of the rebelled people was not the democratic character, but rather the Christian character and the liberal character of our struggle. And with a geopolitical advantage that an independent Greek state could have, unlike, but sometimes also in conjunction with the Ottoman Empire. 200 years later, the major issues of the Greek foreign policy and of the defense policy are articulated around the same issues. The recognition of the independence of the young Greek state by the then powers, all monarchic powers, was achieved on condition that in Greece a monarchy would have prevailed. So in 1830 our state was recognized, and the initial territory was granted not as a liberal democracy but rather as a monarchy. Transition from absolute to constitutional monarchy was long enough, from 1827 to 1864. Universal suffrage, especially the male, was established very early. The constitutional system was organized, set up, and working as a fully fledged system, and that was surprising, impressive back then, very early indeed. And so the thread that passes through the history of these 200 years is a continuous convergence between national and territorial integration. On the other hand, the institutional, constitutional, and democratic integration of the country. Democracy and the rule of law sometimes take steps forward, retreat for the sake of territorial integrity. Greece, despite the early emergence of liberal ideals, has not found it easy to reach a self-confident liberal democracy. Despite the universal value that democracy, rule of law, and human rights claim, liberal democracy is a synonym to a Western democracy. It is the acquis of the West and a conditio sine qua non for for social cohesion and economic development, growth, and vice versa. Greece has been fortunate enough in all the critical moments to opt for the West, for belonging to the West, as Mrs. Koulouri has said, with a great share of the Greek people to maintain some Eastern illusions and senses of guilt. The most we have, for example, European democracy, which is identified with the foundation of European integration. European democracy, especially in with the heritage of the interwar years, knows that nationalism is a pathology. Democracy can either be liberal or vanish. Europe knows very well that a leader elected by great majority and so greatly legitimized, expressing, majority democracy, when undermining the rule of law, they undermine the democracy and the very identity of the European Union, which is why European identity very often is afraid of a possible outcome of referenda and elections in some of the member states, which may have majority democracies, but not liberal democracies. And this goes for democracy in the US after the Trump-related experience, and with Trumpism being still vivid and expressing a wide share of the American society, despite the measures taken by the Biden administration. Now that President Biden asks Europe for the West to reconstruct itself as a Euro-Atlantic axis, we see how difficult it is to apply a foreign policy founded on liberal democratic values. And this can also be seen by in non-democratic Arab states or China, for example, which believes in meritocracy, or with relation to Russia, to Belarus, especially after Belarus, which after the other day's event has much to say. I need to say that this is the continent in which democracy will be put on trial, will be challenged, especially in India because of its size. So democracy will be challenged in India especially. So coping with the pandemic there is very critical for the prospect of liberal democracy, and this is what we should discuss and have in mind. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Venizelos. Indeed, I believe that you have efficiently set the context and the lessons drawn. And having said that, now we can give the floor to Daniel Ziblot and the Kyriakos Mitsotakis, the Prime Minister, and of course attend their conversation. I would like to repeat that this discussion is available both in Greek and in English. Thanks to the internet, we can converse with all the people, with all the attendants, and there are people listening to us from Australia to the US.
A very dear friend from the past. We worked together back at Harvard in the 90s, Elaine Papoulias, who proves the power of Greek diaspora. She is the executive director of the Center for European Studies at Harvard University, an eminent center for the study of Europe at the heart of American academia. She will help me. She will go ahead in presenting our two main speakers of this evening. Elaine, the floor is yours.
Kalispera. Thank you very much, Dimitri.
Hello.
It's an honor and a pleasure to join you. Greetings, everyone, from the Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies at Harvard. It's truly an honor to participate alongside this distinguished group of speakers today. And I'd like to thank Mr. Andriadis and the Cultural Society for convening us. Initiatives such as these that build bridges of dialogue between the worlds of academia and practice are critically important and help to advance solutions to global challenges. As we prepare to celebrate Harvard's graduation tomorrow, it is a distinct pleasure that we are joined in discussion with Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis, one of the university's outstanding graduates. Prime Minister Mitsotakis may recall that the keynote address at his Harvard College graduation in 1990 was given at Harvard by the Chancellor of West Germany, Helmut Kohl. In his speech that day, Kohl remarked that, quote, "We must implant democracy where dictatorship prevailed for decades." In that immediate aftermath of the collapse of communism, it may have been hard to imagine the perils that would threaten democracy in the 21st century. Prime Minister Mitsotakis graduated from Harvard armed not only with 2 degrees, but also with an appreciation for the transformative power of human thought and a commitment to reason and truth as a means to advance the public interest. Less than 3 decades later, he was elected to lead Greece at perhaps one of its most delicate moments since its transition from dictatorship to democracy. He is uniquely positioned to share insights on democracy, especially at a moment when the world seems perhaps more difficult to lead than ever before. I'm also very pleased to welcome my colleague Daniel Ziblot, one of the world's preeminent scholars of democracy and an inspiring educator. Dr. Ziblot is the Eaton Professor of Government at Harvard and Director of the Transformations of Democracy Group at the WZB Social Science Center, Berlin. He is the author of 3 books. His latest award-winning book, How Democracies Die, co-authored with Steve Levitsky, is a product of 20 years of research. It's a New York Times and Der Spiegel bestseller and has been translated into 22 languages, including, of course, Greek. It's a publication revered as much in the world of scholarship as it is in practice. The Washington Post recently reported that when How Democracies Die was published in 2018, President Biden became captivated by the book, made copious notes on its pages, carried his copy everywhere, and often pulled it out to share key passages with interlocutors. Barack Obama also praised the book, noting that, quote, "It is a useful primer on the importance of norms, institutional restraints, and civic participation in maintaining a democracy, and how quickly those things can erode when we're not paying attention." It's a privilege today to unite Prime Minister Mitsotakis and Professor Ziblot in the discussion of this important topic. Professor Ziblot, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Elaine, for the very kind introduction. And it's really a great honor to join all of you and Prime Minister Mitsotakis as well for this wonderful event. And I hope to do it something like this again in the future in Athens or in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But it's nice to do this by Zoom today. So again, thank you, everyone. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes. And the occasion, of course, for this event is the 200th anniversary of the 1821 revolution, which is important for Greece. But I think it's also important for democracy globally as well. Samuel Huntington, the great Harvard political science, once noted that democracies aren't born alone. And in fact, the shattering of authoritarian regimes typically occurs when it's happening somewhere else nearby. He called this phenomenon democratic waves. And so the idea is that when a democracy emerges, it's likely happening somewhere else close by. Professor Huntington famously had said that there were 3 great historical democratic waves, the first beginning around 1830, running through the 19th century, the second after 1945 and the end of World War II, and the third beginning in the 1980s, getting full steam after 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. As smart as Professor Huntington was, I think he got the starting date of the first wave potentially wrong, 1830. He had in mind, of course, the French Revolution of 1830, the Reform Acts in Britain in the 1830s, and democratic reforms in the United States. But as I've come to learn, he could have started that in 1821 in Greece, because this is perhaps really when the first modern wave of democracy really began. Second point, though, about Huntington was that he also taught us that democracy's waves often involve counterwaves, that is, periods of expansion often are followed by periods of recession. This appears almost cyclical. History is not a one-way street. So I think this is a useful starting point to think about our own era, because we are often told we live in an age of democratic crisis. The growth in the number of new democracies in the world, triggered by the collapse of communism, has certainly stalled. Indeed, there's broad consensus, I would say, in the West today that democracy around the globe is under threat. Democratic backsliding seems to be rampant, everywhere from Venezuela to Hungary to India. And suddenly, really quite unexpectedly, I would say, some of the world's oldest democracies in Europe and North America themselves face new challenges. So this latter phenomenon was really the motivation for the book that I wrote with Steve Levitsky, How Democracies Die. And what I want to do in my brief time here today is just to pick up one of the themes from that book and elaborate it a bit today. In particular, I want to zero in on the challenges posed by illiberal populist political parties and demagogic politicians in Europe and North America. But I want to make the slightly counterintuitive argument that the roots of these challenges today in old democracies comes from a surprising source. Political establishments are weakening. In a sense, they're actually becoming more inclusive, in some sense more democratic, which has paradoxically opened the door to populist forces that may themselves threaten liberal democratic institutions. So I'll just spell out this paradox. So start at the beginning. We all know about the rise of illiberal political parties in established democracies today, some of which have begun to attack the norms and the rules of liberal democracy. Trump, Salvini, Le Pen, the Austrian Freedom Party, the Brexit Party, the AfD, and Germany. The rise of illiberalism has gotten a lot of attention, but the bulk of this attention has focused on what we can think of as the demand side of why voters are turning to these sorts of parties and politicians. So some scholars focus on economic causes. They highlight the failure of established parties to protect unskilled workers from the effects of globalization, disappearing jobs, stagnating incomes, rising inequality, especially in the wake of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Other scholars point to the role of race, immigration, and culture, and how Americans and Europeans are responding to immigration and ethnic diversification. We argued something similar to this in our book, How Democracies Die, where we argue it's in part the reaction of a previously dominant white Christian majority to growing diversity and racial equality in the United States that drives polarization and democratic norm erosion. So these standard demand side factors are clearly very important, but I also think they don't tell the whole story. And in fact, I think there's really an important supply side to this story. And that supply side to the story is that it's much easier today to be an electorally successful, illiberal, populist, or authoritarian than it was in the 1950s or 1960s in Western Europe and the United States, because political establishments are weakening across the globe. Okay, so what do I mean by political establishment? Well, here's a definition. Political establishment is the collection of organizations and actors that control the resources politicians need to get elected and to sustain a career. So for the sake of simplicity, I'll just mention three types of establishment organizations. One is political parties, which are important to politicians because they control access to candidacies. Another is business, labor, and other interest groups, which are a critical source of finance and other campaign resources. And then a third is major media outlets, television stations, newspapers, which are the principal means through which politicians gain access to voters. Now, political parties, interest groups, media outlets obviously do not constitute a single monolithic block in a democracy. There's a considerable amount of pluralism and competition among them. But they do impose certain boundaries, both in terms of political style and policy substance. Politicians who exceed these boundaries, who violate certain behavioral norms or push extremist policies, tend to be shunned by the establishment. Party leaders won't nominate them. Union and business leaders won't back them. Mainstream media won't cover them, or at least will be biased against them. Now, half a century ago, all of this mattered a lot because political establishments maintained almost a monopoly over the resources that politicians needed to get elected. In the 1950s, 60s, even in the 1970s, party leaders controlled the candidate selection process. There were no primaries in most democracies for selecting candidates or party leaders. A relatively small number of interest groups provided the bulk of finance and other campaign resources, so business, labor unions. And a limited number of media outlets dominated the media scene. The US famously had 3 television stations, Germany a few, Britain only 1. This meant that any politician who was serious about getting elected had to be on pretty good terms with the establishment. Politicians needed the approval of established parties in order to run for office. They needed the approval of major interest groups so they could raise money, and they needed the approval of major media outlets so they could get decent coverage. This dependence on the establishment had important consequences. It meant that politicians couldn't respond to voters directly and their preferences. They also had to respond to the establishment. They had to strike a balance between appealing to voters and appealing to the establishment. This had a powerfully restraining effect. It basically meant that only insiders or broadly pro-establishment candidates and politicians could have a successful political career. In some sense, you might say this was not terribly democratic, but it was quite stable. Nonetheless, it was the heart of 20th century Western democracy. It's a system in which political competition was genuine, was real, but was nevertheless constrained somewhat by politicians' dependence on the establishment. Politicians who challenge the establishment usually fail. This establishment monopoly existed in democracies all over the world during the 20th century. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, Sweden, Germany, Canada. Now, over the last few decades, establishments across the world have been losing their monopoly over electoral resources, which means they are losing their power over politicians. In many democracies, established parties have lost their monopolies over candidates selection thanks to internal party democratization. Just consider the United States. Historically, the United States political parties have done a pretty good job of gatekeeping. They've maintained a monopoly on selecting candidates, especially for president. And this is important because the US has had no shortage of extremist demagogues. In the 1920s, Henry Ford, we described this in our book, a founder of Ford Motor Company, a rabid anti-Semite, seriously considered running for president. In the 1930s, Huey Long, an autocratic governor from Louisiana, had presidential ambitions. In the 1960s, George Wallace, the segregationist governor from Alabama as well. And there's actually opinion poll data going back to the 1930s that each of these demagogic extremist figures enjoyed roughly 30 to 35% approval ratings, which is actually not so far from President Trump's basic roughly 35% support base throughout his presidency. Now, none of these historic figures, though, despite being very popular, ever made it close to the presidency. So the question is, why not? These figures were mostly kept out in the United States, mostly through an exclusive presidential candidate selection process. Before 1972, American presidential candidates were selected by party leaders during conventions and what we often think of as smoke-filled back rooms. Now, the system certainly was not transparent, it was not inclusive, it wasn't very democratic, but it was an effective filtration mechanism. Party leaders served as gatekeepers. What this meant was that party leaders who had worked closely with potential candidates, knew their strengths and weaknesses, and knew who might be demagogues, played an important role in filtering them out. Now, despite all of the shortcomings of the system, and I'm not saying we go back to the system, it actually had a pretty good record in terms of keeping demagogues out. And so somebody like Huey Long or Henry Ford, it was impossible for them to be a nominee. So most of them didn't even try. Now, the lessons of 2016 in the United States, what happened, one might ask? Well, beginning in 1972, the United States adopted a binding system of party primaries. The party primary system is much more open, transparent, and inclusive, even possibly democratic than the old system. But it also weakened party leaders' role as gatekeepers. It weakened the establishment. So now if a demagogue like Henry Ford were to run for office, it would be much harder to keep him out. And that's what we saw in 2016. Donald Trump was the Henry Ford of his day. But whereas party gatekeepers kept Ford far from the presidency, Trump found the gates wide open. In the United Kingdom, a similar story. The gatekeeping power now lies in the hands of activists, much more in party leaders. Similar story can be told about Germany. So there's a weakening of the party establishment. That's the first development. The second development is in the realm of interest groups. Interest groups have lost their monopoly over campaign finance because candidates can now raise money on the internet. In the US, this has gone the most extreme because of the form of campaign finance, open system of campaign finance. Consider that in 2015, 2016, in the Democratic primary race, Bernie Sanders, the ultimate self-proclaimed outsider, raised as much money as Hillary Clinton, the consummate insider. Outsiders can now rely on decentralized sources of money, reducing the exclusive monopoly of establishment interest groups. And then finally, the third development is the emergence of social media, which has eroded the influence of established media. Today, Twitter, Facebook, and other social media allow candidates to reach voters even if they are shunned by the mainstream media. So my co-author, Steve Levitsky, in 2018, visited Brazil at the beginning of that country's presidential election. He met with a bunch of business leaders, most of whom backed the established center-right candidate. Now, even though that figure was down in the polls, business leaders he was meeting with were convinced he would win because he was backed by a broad coalition of mainstream parties, which following Brazil's election law gave him a huge advantage in allocated TV time. He had more than an hour of free television time a night, whereas the right-wing candidate Bolsonaro had less than a minute. Nobody the Levitsky talked to in Sao Paulo mentioned WhatsApp or YouTube. But Bolsonaro used WhatsApp and YouTube to bypass the TV networks entirely, and he won the election. Likewise, in Germany today, the radical right Alternative for Germany doesn't need mainstream media institutions. I was doing an interview last year with a German journalist with a major German magazine, and she told me that AfD politicians don't we don't interview them anymore. They don't want us to interview them. And she told me they don't need us. Indeed, the AFD has its own YouTube channel that it uses to communicate directly to voters. It also dominates social media, Facebook. So the outsider AFD party is able to reach voters outside of traditional media channels. So in somewhat all of this means that politicians today don't need the establishment as much as they used to. They can raise money online and reach voters via Twitter and Facebook. They can hijack parties through primaries like Trump did in the US, or they can create their own parties like the Five Star Movement in Italy or the AFD in Germany. For outsider politicians, this is in some sense liberating. Freed of their dependence on the establishment, ambitious outsiders can respond directly to what they think voters are concerned about without worrying about what the establishment or elites think. In fact, they can campaign against the elite. In the wake of the financial crisis, the context of rising inequality, heightened racial and cultural resentment, there's a fair amount of public demand for such populist appeals. But one of my points here is that there's always been demand for these kinds of politicians in Western electorates. Again, remember that millions of Americans backed Henry Ford for president in the 1920s. What's new is what's happening on the supply side. It's much easier to bypass the establishment and even oppose the establishment today than it was 50 years ago. So again, this scenario in a certain way more inclusive. Thanks to their newfound independence from the establishment, politicians can be much more responsive to voters. They can give voters at least what they think they want some of the time. But this can also leave us and our democracies more vulnerable to demagogues, many of whom go on to assault democratic institutions. So this is quite a paradox. Western elites used to hate democracy. In the 19th century, in the years before the 1820 revolution and after, economic and political elites were terrified of democracy because they equated it with majority rule and rule by the great unwashed masses. Western elites didn't really accept democracy until the late 19th, early 20th centuries, but part of what made democracy acceptable to them was counter-majoritarian institutions that constitute what we today call representative democracy. But the other thing that made modern democracy safe for elites was the power of political establishments, things like hierarchical party organization, powerful interest groups, and media that provided guardrails to our politics. 19th and 20th century establishments imposed powerful constraints on democratic competition, transforming what could have been highly majoritarian politics into more bounded and elite-centered competition. Engendered the birth to what we can now think of as, after Joseph Schumpeter, Schumpeterian democracy. This was his conception of democracy, system of elite competition. 20th century democracy was profoundly Schumpeterian, and Schumpeterian democracy depended on a powerful establishment. But the days of Schumpeterian democracy may be coming to an end. The establishment's gatekeeping powers have eroded dramatically. The change is more inclusive, even democratizing, but at the same time, it opens the doors to demagogues, many of whom go on to assault our institutions. So we can think of this as a kind of boomerang effect, an unintended effect of broader social and political changes. And so one question we can ask is, how do we get out of this bind? Since our democracies are based on notions of inclusion and toleration, must we tolerate and include forces of exclusion and intolerance? This is certainly a hard dilemma, and it's the task for our democratic politics, I think, to deliver economic growth and good governance, to take the edge of populist politics. This is the work of politicians and citizens alike. But it's also important for citizens and politicians to tend to our institutions, to mend them, to adjust them, to make them robust and agile enough to deal with these new challenges. Because at the end of the day, democracy is not a machine that runs on its own. It requires engaged politicians and citizens to keep it intact. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ziblot. And that was very dense, really very dense and fascinating. We will now pass to the most exciting, I think, part of our conversation here, and most interactive for sure. I will give the floor to the Prime Minister. It's a great honor. It goes without saying to have him with us in his very busy schedule. I know that he has just arrived from Brussels from another summit in the EU. I have to make a confession before I give him the floor. He wanted to discuss this. He has read your works. He's an avid reader. I've known him for many years, and I have always enjoyed our conversations. To tell you the truth, I think he is a closeted scholar, a repressed scholar who chose politics, but always is nostalgic of academia and always tries to inform policy action with ideas. Of course, we are grateful, I am at least, for leading the way in July 2019 in a great victory against populism back then, which is equally, if not more important, than anything that a scholar can achieve. Mr. Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dimitris. Thank you, Stavros, for inviting me. Thank you, Elaine, for bringing back some very fond memories. I've spent a lot of time at the Center for European Studies during my time at Harvard. And I do remember very well Helmut Kohl's speech in 1990. It was a tremendously exciting time when the Berlin Wall came down. I was a senior at Harvard. It was a year before the End of History piece was written by Francis Fukuyama, when we all thought that liberal democracy was a one-way street and that everyone would eventually converge towards that type of governance. And maybe that fantasy lasted for 15 years, but it has certainly been dispelled by the rise of what we call illiberal democracy or authoritarianism, illiberal authoritarianism across the world. I must admit, Professor Ziblot, that I read your book at the same time when Joe Biden was making his own observations, and I also have my copy here with my little notes. And when I read the book in 2018, I noticed that exactly what you describe as trends of authoritarian behavior were exhibited in Greece at the time by a government not from the popular right, but from the radical left. So my first observation is that these types of behavior do not necessarily belong to any particular ideological family. But the trends that you highlight in your book, weak commitment to democratic rules, undermining of traditional institutions, trying to take control of justice, attack on systemic media. But in particular, what you point out, the denial of legitimacy of political opponents was very much a characteristic of the political discourse when we were in the opposition and when Syriza was in power. We still remember in Greece a slogan that was used by Syriza at the time, which I think says it all. Either we get rid of them or they get rid of us. There was almost a sense that we were hated, not because of our ideas, but because of who we were, that we had no right to essentially exist politically. And this was essentially what I consider to be the challenge for me taking over a center-right party. How do you address what I consider to be not just an economic threat, but also a threat to our institutions through democratic means? So I do want to highlight, Elaine mentioned it, that Daniel has written more than one book, but a second book, which has not been really noticed by scholars as much as his last book, is entitled Conservative Parties and the Birth of Democracy. And in How Democracies Die, I think he makes a very valid point, which I think is very relevant for Greek democracy, that conservative party reform has essentially the potential to catalyze democratic rebirth. And I think this is exactly what happened in Greece when we essentially changed a new democracy, a traditional center-right party. We essentially recognized that we were part of the establishment, but we infused our politics with anti-establishment elements, if that makes any particular sense to you. So we used social media. We opened up the party to new candidates. We broke down traditional barriers and essentially made it very, very clear that the institutional arrangements that had, to a certain extent, contributed to the crisis in terms of special interest groups, labor unions, needed to be countered, but from a mainstream party that essentially moved towards the political center and did manage to win a national election. Illiberal democracy cannot be established in one term. Usually, it is those leaders that win a second term that become really dangerous for the institutions. And in that sense, I think our democracy has proven tremendously resilient. We are an example of a resilient democracy. We went through a massive economic crisis, and we went through the rise and fall of a typical populist party. But our democracy today, I think, is stronger, and we're back towards a path of prosperity. So I think the Greek story tells us a lot of different interesting lessons about how to counter the rise of illiberal democracy by not undermining, but by strengthening democracy and making it fit for the 21st century. That means being much more inclusive. That means giving a voice to those who consider themselves to be outsiders, to foster political participation. It means sometimes challenging even systemic media and making our voice heard more through the social media channels, but without replicating the visceral sort of level of debate that usually takes place in those channels. And one last observation, because we should make this a more interactive discussion, is that a crisis such as the pandemic can actually further strengthen democracy. Professor Venizelos rightly pointed out, I think, that basic rights and the rule of law were not challenged during the pandemic. We took very difficult decisions, but we took them with full respect towards our constitutional tradition. And I think this was very important. And we were always very much aware that we had to use extraordinary measures to counter an extraordinary circumstance. And reverting to the norm is an absolute necessity once we stop facing the emergency of dealing with the pandemic. But I think where we have scored point as a democracy is basically in delivering results-oriented policies to address what essentially was a global but also a national crisis. And I think this is particularly crucial in establishing, bonds of confidence between the state, not the political system necessarily, but the state in its ability to deliver public goods and address a national emergency and citizens. I think the best example is our vaccination campaign. We call it freedom, campaign freedom, which is very relevant given that this is a discussion about freedom and democracy. But for the first time, I think Greeks realize that the Greek state can deliver a massively complicated project in a digital manner, but also in a very personal manner. And this is a surprise to them. But I think it is a very, very good foundation upon which we need to build a results-oriented democracy that focuses on growth, but also on social inclusiveness. So let me stop here because I can go on for a long time and pass the floor back to Dimitri to moderate the discussion.
Yes, I wonder if Professor Ziblot has a comment on this.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's a question, I guess. I think it's a question that I get asked all the time that I never have a good answer for. So I'm wondering if the Prime Minister maybe can help me provide answers to this question in the future, or how Greece has dealt with this. Because one of the great challenges for democratic political parties is facing an opposition, as you say, whether in government or in opposition, that doesn't accept this notion of mutual toleration, that treats the other side as an enemy rather than just a rival. And the question that always gets asked to me is, well, if you're a Democrat, how should you respond? Shouldn't you respond in kind? Should you stand by and not engage at the same level and kind of lower yourself to the level of the opposition? Because, and if you don't do that, you risk, it's like fighting a boxing match with one hand tied behind your back. So you have to lower yourself to the other side. My response has always been, no, you have to continue to engage at the level and treat your opposition as legitimate, and to avoid entering a kind of spiral. So, and when I say this, people sort of roll their eyes and say, well, this is the kind of naive view of an academic who's not in the dirty world of actually trying to win election campaigns and so on. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts on how one engages in opposition or a political party that is? And this is not just my own personal question. I mean, this is the challenge that Germany's main parties face when confronting with the AfD, or any country that has a party that's not committed to the basic rules of the game. What's the proper response? Well,
first of all, let me point out that Syriza in opposition clearly is a party that it is the opposition party. It represents 32% of the electorate. It has certain characteristics that we described that make it, in my mind, prone and susceptible towards the patterns that I established, but that they are, constitutionally the main opposition party in Greece, and they are treated, and they need to be treated as such. I want to be very, very clear. That means that we engage, we debate. We have constant debates in Parliament. Sometimes they can get, very intense. The tone, it's up to us to set the tone of the political debate. But hopefully, what we would like to achieve, I don't know if it is possible, would be to return towards a system where you have two parties, which resemble in a way, older two-party systems that at least, abandon some of their more, radical elements. We never really had them, but this is a challenge for Syriza to address. Whether they're in a position to do it, I don't know. What I do know is that the fact that they haven't been able, I think, to fully adjust is a problem for the democracy. I think I would feel much more comfortable if they were to abandon, a part of their radical old self. I don't know if they're capable of doing it, but there are, obligations of public discourse, and you treat them with the respect that they deserve, given that 32% of Greeks voted for them in the election. Now, what did we do? The question is interesting. What did we do before getting elected? I can tell you that we completely ignored them during our campaign. We spoke. We essentially, I did not want to get into. I spoke about my vision for the future of the country, and of course, a campaign is an ongoing political debate. But whenever I had the opportunity, I spoke about our party's vision, my vision, about the future of the country. This is the way, I still like to express myself publicly. But that does not mean that we not respect, the rules of constitutional democracy, the rules of parliamentary debate, that we don't, engage in constant parliamentary debates. We have a very vibrant parliamentary democracy. I've had more than 40 debates with Alexis Tsipras in Parliament over the past 2 years, and hopefully we can nudge them away from their bad habits. That would be good for our democracy as a whole.
Thank you. I have two questions, Professor Ziblot, for you. As I was listening to this fascinating debate, the first has to do with what we used to learn when I was a student of politics at the university, that electoral politics has a moderating effect, that radicals come into the play radicalized, but eventually, in order to win elections and even power, they need to move to the center and moderate themselves. And I wonder if this moderating mechanism of electoral politics has disappeared, has been destroyed from what you were saying just before. The second is that taking Greece and the positive example of Greece as a point of departure, obviously we had the victory of Biden, which was met with great relief here in Europe, across the political spectrum, with few exceptions, I would say. But I wonder how permanent is the defeat, not of Trump, but Trumpism, for sure. Professor Venizelos spoke about Trumpism and the possible return. And I wonder, what is your take in this essential front of democracy, which is the United States? So those two questions for a start.
And I think the two questions are related. Very good questions. I think you're right. I mean, this is how we have this kind of idea in our minds that democracy is a little bit like a market, that it's self-correcting. If you're a business and you sell a bad product, customers won't show up and you go out of business and you have to come up with a new business plan. You fire your employees, you fire the CEO, whatever, and you self-correct. You go home and you fight another day. Similarly, in politics, if you're selling an agenda that voters don't buy, you lose elections, you go home, you regroup, and you come back and fight another day. Now, that self-correcting mechanism, in principle, is supposed to work against extremism in this if we assume that voters are pretty moderate. Because if you veer too far away from where most voters are, and most voters, I think, are reasonable, then you will be punished. Now, I think what's happened, at least, and I think this varies from country to country, but what's happened in the United States, I think you're absolutely right, is that the self-correcting mechanism has broken. And in particular, I think what has happened is that the Republican Party has become more extreme by all measures of international observers and so on, and yet continues to win office. I mean, it doesn't control the presidency or the House or the Senate right now, but the Republican Party has won the presidency 12 of the last 20 years, but has only won the popular vote once. And so what's happened in the United States is that because of particular unusual features of our constitutional structure and the overrepresentation of rural areas, Republicans can do well in rural areas and do much better than they actually perform in terms of popular support. So right now in the U.S. Senate, 50 seats are held by Democrats, 50 seats are held by Republicans, but those Democrats represent more than 40 million more voters than those Republicans do. And so because of a kind of accident of our Constitution that represents rural areas, and because Republicans are more well represented in rural areas, they get this artificial boost. And so the normal thing, if you lose, you go home, you regroup, that mechanism isn't working because they aren't losing. They're losing yet still holding on to power for the most part, or the electoral defeats aren't as severe. And so as a result, there's no rethinking. And so this de-radicalization isn't working. And so in a certain way, just as we know in economics, protectionism distorts firm behavior, I think in the United States, we have a form of constitutional protectionism. And this distorts party behavior. And I think that's partly what we're seeing. And I think so related to that, your second point about Trumpism and what do we are in this kind of curious interlude, I think, where many Americans breathed a huge sigh of relief. We dodged a bullet. The vaccinations are going smoothly. The economy looks like it's recovering. But, there's also this feeling, I think in the national mood that, well, this might just be an interlude. I was just visiting my parents who live in California where the hills were green, but it hasn't rained in a year, basically. And everybody's enjoying the nice weather, but everybody knows that when the fall comes, there's going to be a big fire. I think our national mood is very similar in the sense that there's this high levels of, even though in this interlude, there's high levels of polarization. There's really work underway right now to revamp how elections get carried out at the state level. And I think my biggest concern at the moment is, if Republicans, now that the Republicans have really purged the non-Trump elements from the party, if the Republicans retake the House of Representatives in 2022, and in 2024 the election is close, it could very well end up in the hands of the House of Representatives to decide the results of the election. This happened in the 1800s, this happened in 1877, 1825 in the United States. And if this were to land in the House of Representatives today, I think there's very little question that a Republican-led House of Representatives would choose the Republican president no matter what the results of the election were. And so that would be a real constitutional crisis. So I think that threat is still very real. And so until this kind of self-correcting mechanism kicks in, we're going to suffer the vulnerability of having this, from my view, radicalized conservative party. I think, as the Prime Minister noted, I wrote this book on conservative parties. Conservative parties are necessary for a democracy, constitutional conservative parties. But when they are not constitutional, when there's some question about this, it's a real Achilles heel for a democracy.
I think this is a very good point to go back to the Prime Minister and ask him about conservative parties, center-right parties in Europe, the European front, because I think we can all agree that this has been a primary front, the EPP, of the battle between anti-systemic populism and liberal politics. Now, New Democracy is, I think, the biggest party in EPP as far as percentage is concerned, now that Fidesz from Hungary has withdrawn. And I want to I give the opportunity to the Prime Minister to tell us what he thinks about this battle with Fidesz, Hungary, and with these new parties that are appearing all over Europe and movements. In Italy, in Spain, we have Vox. We had the victory of Ayuso in the Madrid district. I would like to have a comment on that, Mr. Prime Minister, if you may.
Well, it's always difficult to make comparisons, across borders. I think what we have succeeded in doing in Greece was move the party towards a political center, while at the same time addressing, not just as New Democracy, but as a democracy, the problem of Golden Dawn, which was more than just a populist party of the right. It was sort of a neo-Nazi party. And eventually what has happened is that they have been convicted by justice and are treated essentially as a criminal organization. So there is no real strong populist party to the right of New Democracy, but of course that is not necessarily true in other European countries. Maybe Greece, because it went through a deep economic crisis, is in terms of its party systems, maybe it's ahead of the curve, because we've seen the disintegration of the Greek. We saw the disintegration of the Greek political traditional two-party system in 2012. It just exploded essentially, and only one party survived. Only the Demokratia survived, but in 2018 we fell to 18%. We shouldn't forget that. PASOK, Professor Venizelos knows that much better, was the dominant force in Greek politics, 44% in 2009, and essentially at some point lost 90% of its support. So the tectonic plates of politics have already moved in Greece, and the realignment has taken place. But again, the reason why these parties emerge, I think you pointed it out, is on the one hand, economic discontent, and also deep cultural divisions, which are extremely strong and have replaced in many countries even sheer economics as a driving force behind public choice and popular vote. So in that sense, I think the EPP will remain the main force in European politics, but it does face a threat both on its right and in terms of its the more moderate centrist parties. And I don't think that what we have done in Greece is necessarily replicable in other European countries. Look what's happening in Germany, which was, I think, the model for Professor Ziblot's book, that CDU, CSU emerging after the Second World War, purging its ties to Nazism, but still keeping, a strong conservative, even Christian identity, and able to modernize itself. But now it faces a threat from, a Green Party, which essentially is threatening to become the other, dominant force in politics. So I still think that what we've described at the national level is also very true at the European level. The center-right, I think, will remain the dominant political force, but we know the challenges that we need to address. And we also know that in terms of speaking to the next generation, we need to embrace, the digital transformation and the environmental transformation. These are huge megatrends that need to be addressed, and I think they can be addressed by the center-right parties, probably even more successfully than parties, essentially than some parties from the left that don't seem to me to have the right narrative in terms of sustainable environmentalism that also fosters growth. And in that respect, the decision taken by the European Union to borrow at the supranational level and support the member states is also an indication that European institutions have the ability to move and to evolve, because there's been a lot of Europe bashing over the past years. But I think this was an important step and a milestone, in the evolution of the European Union. So because Europe has this hybrid system, nation states are still very strong, but of the European Union as a supranational entity which clearly regulates parts of our lives. We need to look at what's happening both at the national level and at the European level simultaneously.
Thank you. One final question for Professor Ziblot before I open up and take some final comments from our other speakers as well, Professor Koulouri and Professor Venizelos. Professor Ziblot, Professor Venizelos spoke about India as a very important country at the very center of this battle between the forces of democracy and authoritarianism. And I wonder, what is your take on the flashpoints? What are the countries and the regions we need to focus on and keep track on this global battle? How global is the battle? I've been listening to Biden a lot about this democracy struggle. If you may give us a comment on Turkey, which is always important in the public discourse here. You speak a lot about Erdogan and Turkey's Erdogan in your books and in your writings. And finally, after the flashpoint, what would be your list of things that we need to do, the liberals, in the broadest sense of the term, in our fight against the forces of anti-systemic populism, if you may?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, just as a realist in a way, the bigger the country, the bigger the ramifications. So that's why India matters so much. And I think we see this battle taking place in India right now between populism and the defenders of democracy. And it's a big country, so it matters a lot. And also India is important because it was always such an unlikely democracy from the perspective of so much political science, but it has always been an incredible achievement. And so to sustain this, I think is a great test for democracy. Turkey similarly is a very big country, and given its geopolitical status, it also then raises the significance of developments there. And whether the opposition can muster its strength to dislodge the governing party. I mean, the point is not what you think of the governing party as much as the alternations in government are the definition of democracy. So as long as one doesn't have an alternation in government, the longer one doesn't have an alternation in government, the one more suspicious one has to be that there's such a tilted playing field that a country can no longer be counted as a democracy. And so I think we see similar stories, similar picture in Hungary as well. So these are all very important countries. I think it is a global story, and I guess I would put the point even more broadly that in many, and President Biden does talk a lot about the kind of competition between autocracies and democracies. And one thing I often think is that, especially in COVID times, but in general, there's this sense that democracies seem to be dysfunctional. They're not able to respond to emergencies quickly, and there's all of this polarization and corruption, and politicians carrying out business on the side to raise by selling masks and all of this kind of stuff that makes democracy look dysfunctional in the face of existential crises. But I often think this misunderstands the situation, because one of the major differences between authoritarian systems and democracies is that democracies are very transparent. It's sort of like being able to see into your neighbor's apartment when they have the curtains open. You see all of the fights taking place. In an authoritarian system, the curtains are closed shut. We can't see what's happening, so we don't really know what's happening. And so we mistake the internal fights and squabbles and polarization and discoveries of corruption as weakness, when in fact these are signs of strength. I think this is a sign of democracies in the process of self-correction. And so, I think we shouldn't count democracies out. And in many ways, the story of the US's recovery and its ability to deal with the vaccination process so effectively shows, that although a democracy may respond initially slowly, it can respond because of transparency. So a point in terms of what can liberals do and what should liberals do, I think having a very clear sense of what kinds of behaviors are out of bounds. And so in our book, we propose this litmus test drawing on the political scientist Juan Lin's, accusing your opponents of being enemies, not just rivals, being unambiguous in separating yourself from those who use violence to gain power is absolutely critical. I mean, if there's it's not about using violence yourself. I think the most critical thing that Lin's taught us is that it's often established parties who are ambiguous about this, who tolerate it, who don't criticize it among their own opponents, that really gets democracies in trouble. Third, a kind of embrace of free media, and an unwillingness to kind of try to clamp down on media. And then fourth, a willingness to play by constitutional rules. I mean, all of these are clear benchmarks, and there should be heated, as the Prime Minister said, there should be debates. That's what democratic politics is about. There should be heated debates about what's the best way to deal with COVID. What should the tax rate be? There's a whole range of policies. How should we deal with the environmental crisis? These are things that are heated, passionate issues. That's what democratic politics are about. But there's certain bounds within which this has to take place. And these four criteria, to me, we have to all have these in our minds. Voters need to have them in our minds. And we need to call out politicians who violate these rules and not be willing to cooperate with them. Because the moment you cooperate with them, it's a slippery slope to democratic demise.
Can I just add one dimension which I think is important to your list? And that is that we need to agree on the facts. Yeah. Which is what makes fake news so problematic. That if we cannot, agree on what is really happening, and we all spin our own reality, that makes the political discourse that much more complicated.
Yeah, and Linz wrote this book in 1978. Before fake news was a real problem. But had he written his book today, he certainly would have added that to the list. I agree with that.
Thank you, Christina, η κυρία Κουλούρη.
Είναι πάρα πολύ
Well, it is indeed very difficult for me to answer to such a dense discussion. I would like to talk about political polarization. Secondly, the enemies of democracy. Thirdly, the international and national paradigm. Very concisely. Polarization is like tango. It takes two to tango. Besides, polarization is different when it takes place in the parliament, before the parliament, and in social media among fans or voters. In any case, what we have experienced in Greece up to 1974 in the political changeover is a democratization course, while the mainstream political parties have cooperated, joined forces to push the others to the extreme in order to have a solid, robust democracy, which is very important because it indeed also addresses the risks that polarization may bring forward. Now, when it comes to democracy, as Professor Ziblot has said, rightly pointed out, political rivals are not enemies. It does not, however, democracy cannot be threatened by just one leader. One needs to have the joining forces by interest groups and other support groups in order for a leader to have the necessary power in hand in order to jeopardize democracy. If we as civil society do not have the necessary checks and balances, then we cannot only accuse the political powers or governments, but the society at large. Thirdly, you have insisted on the national paradigms, comparative thinking that Professor Ziblot has rightly mentioned is very helpful. However, today I believe that the national paradigm has taken steps backwards, and pandemic has highlighted that. Maybe we need to shift to other tools, instruments, in order to see whether these international connection, when it comes to conspiracy theories, that in fragment of seconds literally may reach from one part of the globe to the other, may deserve, and I'm talking with my with my other hat as a historian against a political scientist, maybe all those patterns need to be revisited, taking into account the new reality, this new situation that has shaped. Thank you very much. Well, I know that the role of a moderator is uncomfortable, especially when one needs to converse with Evangelos Venizelos. And having said that, I would like to congratulate the interpreters for having been up to the task. Professor Venizelos, you have the floor.
A kind of a global remark. Liberal democracy is always a democracy at stake, a kind of risk democracy. For ideological and constitutional reasons, it is obliged to give space to action to its enemies, to tolerate them. Now we need something more, a more clever democracy. I understand very well the remark made by the Prime Minister concerning the democratic resilience, but maybe this approach is a reassuring approach. We not a defending liberal democracy. We need a kind of democratic inclusiveness that works not only on the institutional and political level, but also on the economic and social level. Otherwise, liberal democracy risks becoming historically naive and self-destructive. To be more brief and concrete, the primacy of economy is needed the primacy of democracy. It is the primacy of politics. This is the main stake for the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, I don't know how to conclude who wants to take the floor first. Maybe Professor Ziblot, and then we conclude with the Prime Minister.
So final thoughts. Well, I think that, the point that I made about the differences between democracies and authoritarian systems is maybe the point. I'll just repeat that because I think that this is the most critical issue in a way facing all of our societies as we deal with the issues such as climate change, apparently unsolvable problems. I mean, one of the major challenges facing our societies today is when we have an emergency, how do we deal with it in a way that also keeps our constitutions intact? And I think there's a perception that authoritarian systems can deal with this better because they don't have to deal with the bounds of constitutions. And so things such as climate change or the next pandemic, I think is absolutely critical for democracies to figure out how to cope with these existential crises where time is of the essence. And I think climate change is the issue that won't go away, where time is of the essence. And I think many young people feel, why, if the earth is going to, how much time do we really have? Why do we have to dispense with, why do we have to use our democratic institutions if our lives are going to be at stake? And so I think the real challenge for politicians, for thinkers, for all of us is to think about ways of addressing these kind of emergency situations with our democratic institutions intact. So I think it comes down to making our governments effective as well as democratic. And this is an old dilemma, but I think it's one that has been given new urgency by our current crises.
Thank you. The Prime Minister, you will be the last. You will have justifiably the final word.
I think the next chapter of liberal democracy inevitably will be written by the next generation, by the young people who are, skeptical but also aware of the challenges. And there is a new cleavage emerging, which has to do with intragenerational justice. The monumental decision of the German Constitutional Court regarding climate change brought this very, very clearly to the forefront. What is our obligation to the next generation? And of course, what does political participation mean for this generation? Is it all sorts of civil society, political activism, which is absolutely necessary, but is it also participation in what I would call hardcore electoral politics? And I always raise a big concern here regarding the young generation. Democracy needs political actors, and if our young generation feel that it is meaningless to participate in the political process, then inevitably they will leave space to others. After the Second World War, I think one of the successes of the Western democracy was that it attracted the best and the brightest. Is that still the case? Maybe you can tell us, Professor Ziblot, what your students at Harvard think these days, not to mention that the best and the brightest are only at Harvard. I'm curious to see what Professor Venizelos has to tell us about, the best and the brightest at the Greek law schools. Are they as interested in participating in the public domain? Or has public participation become so difficult because of the visceral state of the public debate, because of the fear that you can be obliterated by social media, that the cost incurred in public participation for oneself, for one's family, is just not worth assuming. That, for me, is a very important challenge. I don't have the obvious answer, but it is a concern for me regarding the way the next generation is going to shape, the next chapter of liberal democracy, because it's Dear Vangeli, it's not going to be written by us. It's going to be written by the next generation.
I think this is very right, and we have all been on a personal level witnessing this kind of obliterating attempts, and we have survived. I think all of us in politics, and it is a huge challenge and problem. Let me now wrap it up by thanking our distinguished speakers from overseas and from Greece, the Prime Minister, Professor Ziblot, Professor Venizelos and Professor Koulouris, and of course Elaine Papoulia, for making the time and for being with us. This has been not only an honor, but a great pleasure as I was listening to you in this to this fascinating discussion. It really served the purpose, and I hope we can have this kind of debates more, the world of ideas and scholarship with the world of policy action and real politics brought together in this beautiful way. So from the cradle of democracy, from Athens, Greece, where the idea and the practice of democracy were first born, let me thank the Cultural Society of Thessaloniki, Stavros Andreadis and all his wonderful colleagues at the Society for bringing us together, congratulating them for the initiative. In a very meaningful way, I think we honored the spirit of the Greek Revolution in this glorious bicentennial. And we hope next time we can speak from next to each other, either here or in the Athens of America, as it is called, in Boston, in Cambridge, at Harvard. Thank you very much. Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ εκ μέρους των διοργανωτών για αυτή την εξαιρετική πραγματικά συζήτηση.
I would like to thank you on behalf of the organizing committee for this extremely interesting debate. Thousands of people from Greece and abroad have indeed attended and listened to you. Thank you very much. I wish you all the best.